Okay, we're a couple minutes after 7, and it looks like people are rolling in, have slowed down, so we're going to get started for the evening. So thank you everyone for joining us. It's really nice to have, we've got quite a group of bird and nature enthusiasts here. Yeah, we're looking forward to spending the evening learning about migration and talking about ways that we can help birds through their long journeys. My name is Kelsey Bell. I am the strategy and outreach specialist for Lights Out Wisconsin. Lights Out Wisconsin is a coalition of conservation and dark sky organizations that are working together to reduce the impacts of light pollution in Wisconsin. Lights Out Wisconsin was formed in the fall of 2025, so we're fairly new, with the goal to reduce light pollution when dark skies matter most for wildlife, people, and dark skies. Lights Out Wisconsin tonight has the pleasure of hosting tonight's event with Southern Wisconsin Bird Alliance, SOS Save Our Songbirds, and Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin. This is the second webinar in the series. So you can see on the screen, we've got our schedule there. And the series focuses on the journeys that many animals make each spring and fall to find food and shelter that they need throughout the year. And tonight we are going to learn from Kyle Horton on how predicting bird movement and light pollution coalesces into lights alerts. Tomorrow evening, we will have a presentation from Kirsten Hall about how important coffee, the coffee that we drink, is to migratory birds and how we can protect winter habitat through coffee. Each of these presentations are recorded, so if you missed yesterday's or you can't attend tomorrow's, we'll put the link in the chat and you can watch them once we share the recordings. There was also a series, a similar series that we did last year, and that focused on monarch butterflies, hummingbirds, and chimney swifts, and you can view those presentations using the same link. So lots to learn there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Kyle can share his, and while he is doing that, I will introduce him. So Dr. Kyle Horton, yeah, there we go. Dr. Kyle Horton is joining us today from Purdue University, where he is an associate professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources and leads the Purdue Aeroecology Lab. Dr. Horton earned his Master of Science in Wildlife Ecology from the University of Delaware and his PhD in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from the University of Oklahoma. He was also a Rose postdoctoral fellow at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. His research looks at how birds move during migration, how artificial light can affect those movements, and how technology and environmental data, including weather forecasts, can help us predict migration. Dr. Horton helped develop and launch the first nationwide bird migration forecast for the United States, giving us a new way to see and understand migration. His work also helps us understand how human activities can affect birds and how we can use that information to reduce our impacts. We're really grateful to have him here to present to us today because I know he's very busy. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Horton. And I think I unmuted you. Oh, I can't hear you though. Oh, try that
Can you hear me
again.
now?
Sure can.
Cool, thanks.
Great.
Alrighty. Well, thanks so much for having me. I just want to thank Bruna, Lisa, and Kelsey for all their work and organizing this and all the stuff that happens behind the scenes to set up a seminar series like this. It's really exciting to see the trio of talks that you've had lined up as well. So that's really quite exciting. And thanks to all the sponsors that are supporting this really cool series as well. And thanks to you all for coming out for an evening of chatting about birds and migration and a little bit about radar. And there might be a little bit of sort of back and forth. I've got some interactive things in here, and we'll see how that plays out tonight. And so in terms of timing, I'll try to shoot for, about a 40-minute talk for tonight. Hopefully it'll be fun and engaging. And as I set up this talk, I sort of thought about, what would be useful to the community, talking about light pollution, migratory birds, tools and strategies for trying to help those birds that, we all care about. We came here tonight to hear about it, and all of you are probably predisposed and interested in this topic already. But what I want to do tonight is sort of give you some of the background of the tools that we make, and then give you a little bit of information of sort of how, as they say, the sausage is made, and then allow you to interpret the data really for your own conservation implications. Maybe it's for your bird watching, maybe it's just for general interest in bird migration. And so hopefully after this, you'll learn a little bit more about some of the things, the maps that you see ultimately online. And so just to launch into tonight's talk, I always like to start with pretty pictures of birds. Because a lot of what I do is working behind a computer, working with numbers and statistics, and usually in a capacity where I don't get to see these pretty colorful birds that we're ultimately trying to save. We're looking at sort of, pixels on a screen for making maps, but really those pixels are made up of these colorful, charismatic species that are sweeping through the skies of Wisconsin on really any given night, spring or fall. And so I'm an avid bird watcher and photographer and love sort of seeing these birds. And so these are all photos that I've taken across the years, going out and bird watching. And so I just really sort of enjoy this side of ornithology. And so, to give a little bit of background on bird migration, it sounds like you heard a little bit about the wonders of migration last night if you're able to attend that seminar. And this might be a little bit of a refresher now as well. And so, when we think globally about bird migration, and we think about globally the distribution of bird species, in the world, there's about 11,000 species of birds. And then when we characterize those of saying, how many of those 11,000 are migratory, our number is often in the range of about, 19% are considered migratory. It might be a really long distance migrant, it might be a short distance migrant, nonetheless migratory in nature. We can push that question, a little closer to us. We might say, what percentage of bird species in North America are considered migratory? And that number looks quite different than the global number of migratoriness. In fact, it's about 70% of our North American bird species are migratory. So it's really the dominant thing that most birds do. The next question that gets us closer to maybe our interest for tonight is we could ask a different question. We could say, of the birds that migrate in North America, do they migrate during the day or do they migrate at night? And what we actually see when we address that question is that of the birds that are migratory, 80% migrate at night. And so it's really the dominant behavior of most of the songbirds that we're interested in are winging it long distances under the cover of darkness. And so I like to think about, Kelsey introduced what my lab does a little bit. We think about airspaces as critical habitat for migratory organisms, especially birds. And so I like to start in this framing. By volume, the ocean is regarded as the largest habitat on Earth, covering 71% of Earth's surface. And so that is in fact true. But I would sort of argue with the assessment here. When we think about habitats, right, we think about a terrestrial habitat, we might think of an aquatic habitat, but these birds that we're talking about tonight are moving under the cover of darkness, moving through airspaces, and those airspaces aren't captured by these percentages. So life moves beyond the surface of the Earth. And I like to contend that the lower atmosphere is, I think, Earth's largest habitat. And by volume, it's larger than, the volume of our oceans or all of our bodies of water put together. And so we could either sort of contend that these birds are really remarkable at moving through stuff that's not a habitat, or that that airspace is in fact their habitat during migration. And I use this species here, the magnificent frigate bird. It's a bird that you can find in the southern United States, but it's a bird that's quite remarkable at flying consistently. It will fly upwards of 3 to 4 months consistently. And I don't mean that it flies during the day and it lands and sleeps on the ground at night. What I mean is that for 3 to 4 months, it is always in the air. It is foraging, it is sleeping, it is doing all of that while in the air flying. And so its habitat for a large chunk of the year is, in fact, the airspace. And so coming back to the birds of North America, we can think about, these habitats, right? We can think about birds stopping over in a terrestrial habitat during migration. We could think about maybe waterfowl stopping over in aquatic habitat. But the habitat that we're going to focus on tonight is this aerial habitat. And the study of these aerial habitats is known as aeroecology. And that's why I was introduced as running an aeroecology lab. And so coming back to the vast majority of birds migrate at night, what are some of the nocturnal advantages that birds might have? Let's see if I can get back to the Zoom. Well, maybe not. Here we go. Let's see. Does anyone in the chat want to type in why they think birds could migrate at night or why they've evolved to migrate at night? Fewer predators, good. Navigation by the stars, I like that. Lack of predators, good. Cool. Okay. So these are some of the ideas, right? And so you could avoid predation at night. A lot of the birds that eat these small songbirds are mostly active during the day. Think about hawks, for instance. So you could avoid predation that way. Cooler temperatures. I always like to think of this in terms of exercising, right? If you want to run a race, would you like to run your race when it's 90 degrees? Or would you like to run it when it's 60 degrees? And so as the sun sets, these birds are effectively flying a marathon through the night, doing a lot of burning a lot of energy and producing a lot of heat. And so moving through a cooler medium is really effective. One that wasn't mentioned here is that the atmosphere is actually much calmer at night as well. And so that relates to this one that Colleen sort of put in potentially better drafts as well. And so this schematic sort of walks through this a little bit. As the sun rises, it starts to heat the surface of the earth. In that, as the surface of the earth heats, we get rising air currents. Those create turbulence in the atmosphere. And some of that turbulent air comes closer to the surface of the earth. And so if you're a small bird, that's a pretty bumpy ride moving through the lower atmosphere. Think of your warblers, your kinglets, which are 10, 20, 30 grams bumping around in a turbulent atmosphere. And so if there's a possibility of avoiding sort of that heating of the Earth's surface, you would start to migrate or take off when the atmosphere calms down. And so that's in fact what happens. As the sun sets, we're going to have a cooler, more laminar flow of the atmosphere, and that's when these small songbirds ultimately take to flight. Alrighty. Okay, so we've learned a little bit about bird migration, background, who's doing it, when they're doing it, why they're doing it. And what I wanted to get to is to start with this map. And so this is probably what's bringing us here tonight for this seminar. This is a forecast of bird migration for the night of August 22nd, 26th, 2026. So this is the forecast for bird migration for tonight. We produced this map earlier today. And so this map has a color gradient. It goes from sort of deep purples to black all the way up to yellows and whites. The yellows and whites here are areas where we are predicting where more birds will be flying tonight. And so you can sort of look at this map and start to understand it a little bit. You can see that we forecast across the United States at about 3 hours after local sunset, all across the US, that 267 million birds will be taking flight. That's our prediction. We can assess that in the morning of what really happened. but generally we get pretty close, at least in terms of where and when the birds are taking flight. And so you might be able to understand this map the way I described it, but you might not understand where the maps come from, what goes into the map, how are they developed, how to interpret them, how best to use them, how could these maps be used for conservation. And so that's where I wanted to start. We're going to start with this map, and then by the end of it, we're going to come back to this map, hopefully in the next 25 minutes. You've absorbed some things that I've said, and you'll understand a little bit more about what goes into this map and how best to interpret it when you see it on websites like Birdcast, or our lab's website. Okay, so that's sort of the layout. So my outline for the next 20, 25 minutes is we're going to ask this question: what is radar? You might be familiar with that term, but you might not know really what's going on with a radar. And so we're going to try to figure that out. How can radar be used for ornithology? And then how can radar data help predict migratory movements? Let's see. I saw something come in the chat, but the way my screen's set up, I can't get back to it. All right, we'll get back to your question, Matt, in a little bit. I'll get there. Okay, cool. All right, so we're going to start with this thought experiment to get us going. And maybe to your surprise tonight, we're going to do a little bit of math. And if that sounds scary, that's okay. I think the math will be straightforward enough that you'll be able to do it in your head. No calculators needed tonight. Okay, so this is our thought experiment that we've got going here. I'm going to give you this prompt. You leave your house where the speed limit is 30 miles per hour. 2 hours later, you return home. Okay, so that's our prompt. I'm going to ask you this question. How far did you actually drive? And so you could drop it in the chat if you have an answer or you care to volunteer an answer. No pressure, get it right or wrong. No issues there. So I'll give you a second. You leave your house where the speed limit is 30 miles per hour. 2 hours later, you return home. How far did you actually drive? All right. Carl said insufficient data. Steve said 60 miles. Joanne said 60. Okay. 60. We're getting some 60s. Okay. So in the prompt that I just gave you, some of you could be right. Carl said insufficient data. And so that's sort of where I was hinting at. So imagine the road's really curved, for instance, right? And so maybe it's a winding road. Matthew just said maybe you stopped at the grocery store, right? And so there wasn't anything in the prompt that necessitated that you went at 30 miles per hour. It was just the speed limit. You could have stopped, you could have paused, you could have gone a mile and then stopped and then turned around. And so you really don't have enough information to answer this question. You maybe could have gone 60 miles and come back, but there's no condition that necessitated that. So we don't know. Okay, so we're going to come back to this. A revised thought experiment. You leave your house, you drive in a straight line, never stopping at a constant speed of 30 miles per hour. You return after 2 hours. How far did you actually drive? And so let's try this revised thought experiment. If you want to jump into the chat, you can drop in an answer. And I assure you this will eventually relate back to birds. All right, so we have our first response in here of 60 miles, 60 again. I like the comedy in here. Okay, good. Okay. So getting back to this, the correct answer in this regard is 60 miles. And so you could go in a straight line 30 miles one way and return directly on that path. Again, this is assuming you didn't have to slow down to turn around. Let's just assume you instantaneously accelerate back up to 30 miles an hour. You come back and you've traversed the total of 60 miles. Okay. And so then I could ask you, which way did you go in terms of that direction, right? There's a straight line. You could have gone this way. You could have gone this way. You could have gone this way. You could have really gone any spot on this circle here. And so this principle is very closely how a radar operates. And so let's just start swapping out some things from our examples here. Okay, and so we'll remove the house and we'll replace that with a radar. And instead of all of these end destinations, let's replace them with birds. And so this is precisely how a radar works. And you are probably familiar with an image that looks like this. It just often in the video, in the Hollywood, in the movies, looks something like this. And so a radar is scanning the horizon, sending out a signal, detecting that signal when the radiation encounters it and is returned. But the thing that makes radar really, really effective is that it's not moving at 30 miles per hour. It is in fact moving, the signal that a radar sends out is moving at the speed of light. And so if we know three things, the trip duration, if we know the speed, we can figure out the third component, the distance or the range. And so if we send out signal, we know the speed that the signal is sent out, we can figure out the distance, aka I'm going to call the range. And so this is what a radar is effectively doing. These radars, they send out a packet of radiation. It moves at the speed of light. It encounters a target. It sort of activates that target in some capacity. And then a small sliver of that radiation is returned in all directions, and a small sliver returns directly back to the radar. And so if we know how long it took to go out and to come back, we know how fast it was going, we know the distance that that bird is from the radar. But hopefully, broadly, that principle makes sense. The math of it won't matter for tonight. But like I said, the radio waves that we send out from these radars don't move at 30 miles per hour. They move at the speed of light. And the speed of light is about 670 million miles per hour. It is incredibly fast. It's hard for me to come up with good analogies to really showcase how fast the speed of light is, but hopefully these next few slides will get you really close to that appreciation. And I'm a big fan of using GIFs, and I love Christmas Vacation. So this is my first depiction that it's really fast of Clark Griswold sledding. Another more scientific approach to this, in 2 hours, we could go 53,875 times around Earth at the speed of light. Incredibly fast. Okay, so my next little activity, I want everyone to snap their fingers. Nothing remarkable will happen, but if you snap your fingers, you get the gist of where I'm going with this. If you snap your fingers, there's been science done on snapping your fingers. It usually takes about 0.007 seconds to snap your fingers. In that amount of time, if you were traveling at the speed of light, you could go from Madison, Wisconsin to Washington, D.C. and back in that amount of time that it took you to snap your fingers. And so these are the speeds that these radars are operating at of sending signal out and returning signal back to the radar. Okay. So radar itself is an acronym. And so it's a term we often use, but it stands for something. Radar stands for radio detection and ranging. So the radio part is that radiation that we've been talking about that moves so quickly. The detection is detecting targets out usually in the atmosphere for our purposes. And then ranging is that part that we can determine how far away something is from the radar. The radars that we use to make the maps that I talked about look something like this. You probably have seen them. They're usually, when you drive by an airport, you would see something like this. And so in that sort of golf ball-like dome, there is a dish that is scanning the horizon of the atmosphere. And so these are NEXRAD radars. They stand for Next Generation Radars. They are called WSR-88Ds, and it just stands for Weather Surveillance Radars. They're engineered in 1988. When they came out, they all had Doppler technology. And so we'll talk a little bit about what Doppler means. And so across the United States, we have an array of these radars. And so at each one of these white points on this map exists one of those radars. There's 143 of them sprinkled across the United States. There's a little bit more in the eastern US than there is in the western US. There's some reasons for that, but this is where all of our radars reside. And so inside that dish looks something analogous to this. A big dish scanning the horizon, sending out little packets of radiation to detect usually weather phenomena, but for our purpose, birds. Okay, so we had three objectives. I'm hoping going through that, albeit a little quickly, that you have a better appreciation for what radar is. Our next question is, okay, we did this little toy example with the car and driving. We looked at, how we could send out radiation to detect a bird maybe, but how can we use radar data for ornithology? That's the next part I want to get to. Okay. So I'm a big believer of looking at something to try to visualize it, to understand it, and then we're going to do that for radar data. And so we're going to be looking at raw radar data. This would be like the radar data that you turn on the weather channel, where you have a weather application that you're going to see. And so what a meteorologist sees when they look at radar data. So we're going to look at a few examples here. This is for April 29th, 2025. I'm going to show you some radar data from my local radar here in Indiana. So this is going to be the Indianapolis radar. Covers most of the state. We're going to look at three radar products. These products are called reflectivity, radial velocity, and correlation coefficient. Okay, those three products all measure three very different things. From a meteorologist, a storm might look like this. And so reflectivity measures, you could think of it as the amount of rain in the atmosphere. The warmer the colors here, these oranges, reds, are where there's more rain in the storm system passing through Indiana. You can see the storm system moving west to east. That's usually the dominant pattern of our weather in North America. And so think of amount for reflectivity. Radial velocity measures something different. It actually measures the speed and direction of a weather system. It does it in an odd way, though. It measures the speed coming towards or away from the radar. And so all of the greens in this image here of that storm system are approaching the radar. All of the red colors are moving away from the radar. The deeper the colors, the faster the speed. And then lastly, you might be saying, how do I know that this is rain? This next product, correlation coefficient, is a good indicator of when something is characterized as rain. The more red the color on this variable, the more likely it is to be rain droplets. I won't get into the backstory of it, but it's a good filter for us to say, is this birds or is this rain? In this case, I feel very confident, given the values I see in correlation coefficient, that this is in fact rain. Okay, so we've looked at a meteorological example. I want to now transition to what I see when I look at radar data on a case where there's a lot of bird migration. And so we're going to jump to a different time. We're now looking at October 7th, 2025. We're going to be looking at nighttime data, but we're going to be looking at the same three radar products: reflectivity, radial velocity, and correlation coefficient. And so now keep in your head what the rain looked like. Now we're going to be looking at bird migration, and it is going to look much, much different. Reflectivity now, you could think of it as the amount of birds in the airspace. There's some rain actually showing up in this depiction here, but on this fall migration night, birds are heading south, and there's tremendous numbers of them starting to fill the airspace as the sun sets. And so we can think of reflectivity as measuring the amount of birds. Radial velocity, like I mentioned, measures the speed and direction of stuff in the air. In this case, speed and direction of birds. This is fall migration. Birds are heading south. All of the green areas are approaching the radar, which is in the middle of the image. All of the red areas in the radial velocity are moving away from the radar. And so we can say that the flow of birds is sort of due south on this given night. And then lastly, we want to be confident that, we're not looking at rain, for instance. And so if you remember what correlation coefficient looked like previously, the reds in that product are where we expected to see rain. The blues are biological. In this case, we would relate to birds. Okay. We now have the 3 data products that are used to build out all of the products in Birdcast. So you now have a little bit of an appreciation, maybe an understanding of where the data come from, albeit, again, for one radar site, there's 143 radar sites that look just like this. And so we can use these data, we can ingest them in real time, we can look at them historically back to the mid-1990s, and we can learn the associations of birds and patterns. And so this is what it looks like all stitched together. This product here is reflectivity. And so I'm not sure what it looks like on your end in terms of the motion, but what we're looking at is spring migration, birds lifting off night after night after night, blooms of birds showing up in the blues here, the reflectivity. You can see weather patterns showing up here as well. Again, those are sort of the deeper greens, yellows, and oranges and reds. And those patterns almost always move west to east, weather patterns. That's the dominant flow of weather or rain. And so this is just one of those 3 products. This one's reflectivity. And so we can look at reflectivity. We could pair it with correlation coefficient to identify the rain and remove that. And so that's how we could compare or combine some of the products. Okay. So putting this all together in terms of where the radar data come into play, we can use reflectivity to measure how many birds there are in the airspace. We can use radial velocity to say how fast the birds are flying. We can use correlation coefficient to remove the rain, filter the data to make sure it's birds. We could take the product of these 2 variables to then get a migration traffic rate. We could say how many birds are flowing over a given amount of space for a given amount of time. Good question. I'll get back to your, I'll try to address your question quickly, Bob. In terms of birds versus insects or dragonflies in this context, those can be challenging things to discern. One thing that we often use for filtering our data is speed. Birds have a higher airspeed. Radial velocity measures ground speed, but if we can derive airspeed, which we can, birds often fly much faster than things like dragonflies, at least during migration. And so speed itself can be a filter to differentiate birds versus most insects. Okay, so putting those 3 products together, we can ask a question like, how many birds are passing through in a fall migration across transects across the United States? And so across this white line, we can say about 4.24 billion birds are crossing this white line. We can do this all across the United States to start measuring the traffic rates that we see moving through on a fall migration season. We can do this in spring. We can compare the ratios, for instance, are some of the applications. Okay. And then putting it all together in a visual, I downloaded this visual from our website about 10 minutes before I jumped on Zoom. And so it's a little outdated, maybe an hour out of date right now. But this is putting it all together of what the flow of stuff in our atmosphere right now looks like. This is measuring the intensity of migration. It's filtered using correlation coefficient to remove rain. And then it's showing you the speed and direction of the flow with these particles. And so this is a visual that combines all three of the radar products that we just talked about. Okay, so I've got about 10 minutes left. And so I want to cover how we put this together with these data products to then make forecasts into the future. Ooh. Angela's question about discerning birds from bats. Bats are a tricky one. Um, there are some spots in the US where we can be really certain of bats. Roosting bats come out in mass out of caves, out of bridges in the southern United States. They come out in these diagnostic patterns. They almost look like concentric circular rings. We can identify those with algorithms that we have. Low numbers of like tree roosting bats are going to be hard to discern, and they're almost surely swamped by the sheer number of birds that we have migrating. And so just the volume of birds versus bats is it's going to be hard to measure tree roosting bats using radar, at least these types of radar. Okay, so I want to back up and just take a look at a time series of what radar data look like through the Milwaukee, your local radar through Wisconsin, the Milwaukee, Wisconsin radar. And so we're going to look at what a time series of migration data look like. This is going to be for the past fall season in 2025. And so these are the data from your radar. We get these peaks and then we get these troughs. And so the peaks are the big nights of migration. There are often millions of birds migrating on these big peaks in this plot. In fact, it takes about 9 nights for 50% of birds to pass through the Wisconsin area in terms of the migratory birds passing through. And so that's an interesting metric, and it motivates a lot of conservation that we do. And so maybe that was just an odd fall 2025. And so we could look at, spring 2026 data for the Milwaukee radar. And so we process those data, and we can look at something like this. And in fact, that number comes out again, actually, in a fortunate way. And so that seems consistent. 9 nights it takes for 50% of migratory passage to occur through the Wisconsin area, once again in spring. And so we can look at that not just for, 2 seasons or 2 years, but we can look at it across lots of years. And I'll show you that in a second. And so this is where we're at currently in the migration season through the Milwaukee radar for this fall. And so I processed this right before I jumped online. This last dot is the migration for last night, not tonight, but last night when we had data come in. And so we've got a long season ahead of us in terms of migration. And so we've crunched the numbers all across the United States for every radar for about 25 years of radar data for spring and for fall. And that metric comes out pretty consistently. It takes about 10 nights across the United States for more than 50% of birds to pass through any given area. Those 10 nights won't be the same season to season. They won't be the same across locations. But if we can identify those 10 nights of big migration, we could do some applied conservation action, like turning our lights off at night to help these birds pass through safely. And so we got to thinking in terms of knowing those numbers, can we forecast bird migration, right? Can we actually predict where and when these birds will be taking off, and particularly so on those big nights of migration? And so we had a lot of radar data at our disposal. We were able to process it somewhat quickly and efficiently. We could do it night after night. And so we could start to say, what are the dominant drivers of bird migration, right? And so in the chat, you can jump in and just mention, what do you think is a good predictor of why birds migrate on a given night? Okay, Linda put in weather, wind direction, cold front, warm fronts. Good, I like that. Wind direction, great. Okay, so I think you're hitting it, right? And so, given what we've been talking about, right, the atmosphere plays a really important part about why and where and when birds take flight. And so, it might be things like air temperature related to these cold fronts, warm fronts, wind speed and direction, whether it's pushing or pulling birds, blowing them off course, and then a whole slew of other potential predictors here. And so we can take those data on a given night, link it with the radar data, and learn those patterns. And so that's exactly what we've done. And so I won't go into the details tonight, just for the sake of time. We can use those radar data, pair them with those predictors that you just mentioned, learn the associations. And so this is what we would call a statistical model. We build that model, and then we pair it with new forecasts of the atmosphere. And so we take what meteorologists make every day, we push it through our statistical model, and then we make a bird migration forecast. And so a forecast looks something like this. This is for almost 10 years ago of one of our first forecasts, April 26th, 2016. The warmer colored areas are where we expect more birds to be migrating on this given night. And so we made a forecast, and then we could link it, we could pair it with what the radars actually measured. And so that's what I'm going to overlay here. This is, in fact, what the radar actually measured on this given night. And so it's really a close comparison. We estimate about 241 million birds were taking flight on this given spring migration night. Again, for the sake of time, we won't go into it, but night after night we did these type of analyses, and the patterns were really quite promising and really encouraging and exciting. And so we made these forecasts, and these forecasts live at this website, birdcast.org. And you can see them also at the aeroecolab.com's website. And so now we are coming back to where we started in the talk. And so I said, hopefully in 25 minutes time, you would have a greater appreciation for what went into this map. And so what went into this map is a ton of radar data. Behind this map is sitting about 25 years of radar data. What is sitting behind this map is a workflow that is automated that runs 4 times a day to produce maps like this. And so that workflow ran earlier today and produced 3 maps, one for tonight, tomorrow, and the night after. And so these maps are really great. They show where the vast majority of birds will be flying, but they don't tell you the night of the biggest migration, right? Because it might look different between Wisconsin and Indiana versus Texas, for instance. And we also know that birds are on some nights when there's a lot of bird migration and there's really intense lights, birds can be attracted to those light sources. And so this is an example of this. All the stuff flying around in this video is actually birds caught up in lights. And so we're trying to think of strategies to make those maps look different, to prioritize where and when you should turn off your lights on select nights. And when I mean select nights, we try to prioritize turning off lights at minimum on the biggest nights of migration. And so this is what we call our lights out alert maps. That is the same exact map that I showed previously. It's just now colored in a relative way. The red areas are where we are predicting that you'll be having one of those 10 big nights of migration. And so tonight, we're actually expecting a big pulse of migration through most of Wisconsin. You can see different parts in Minnesota. We can see parts in Colorado and New Mexico are showing red alerts. All of the orange areas are likely to have a high amount of migration, just not in the top 10% of the biggest nights for this season. And so hopefully, you can dig into these. We make these state-specific maps as well. We make those for tonight, tomorrow, and the night after. We try to identify how many birds are flying over the state of Wisconsin, how many are flying over specific cities. And so we try to make these data readily available. And we just truly appreciate the folks like all of you that are interested in these applications and that are also advocating for turning off lights for migratory birds. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions. I hope, going through our objectives, a little bit more about radar, how it can be used for ornithology, and how we actually develop the forecast and lights out alert maps that we've linked here and shared with y'all's community. And so we really do appreciate it. And I'm happy to take any questions if there's time. Thanks so much for the invitation and excited to chat with you.
Thank you so much, Kyle. If folks want to, if you have questions, put them in the chat, as Kyle said, and we'll either get them to him, unless Kyle, you can read them now, right?
Yep, I can jump on and read them. If you want to unmute and say your question, that's easier too. I'm happy with that, but writing it out might be easier too. I appreciate all the nice comments. That's really nice of you all.
And there was the question from Matthew earlier, but I feel like you answered that. Um, how birds were able to be counted, predicted versus actual.
Oh yeah, these are good questions. Let me do the one from Scott, and then I'll get back to the one of the predicted versus actual. Scott's question about sort of these gaps that show up in some of the maps, they look like the birds are flying in these discs almost, if that's what you're referring to. Um, what is happening there, I think you sort of alluded to it. The radar beam comes out at a shallow angle. And so it's a shallow angle that's tilted upward. As you get further from the radar, the beam is getting higher and higher. The curvature of the Earth also plays into that, and that almost the curve of the Earth is bending away from the radar beam. And so, like the phrase that you hear flying under the radar, effectively, as you get further from the radar, the birds are flying under the radar beam. The beam is just getting so high. The birds, don't know where the radars are. They're flying generally at a constant altitude. And so, for that reason, we start to get gaps. We use data to learn where we feel confident in where the birds are flying to then interpolate or predict into the empty spaces. In terms of the actual versus predicted, these are some of the challenges. We've done a lot of validation. We have small scale radars where we go out and count the number of birds that are flying through and then relate it to these bigger radars. That's a point of validation. We've done this with counts the next day on the ground. We've done this with moon watching, done this with thermal imaging. There's a lot of relationships that go into these things. With our forecasts, almost always, like without fail, the forecast will underpredict the biggest nights of migration. And there's a bunch of statistical reasons for this. We still feel confident that we capture the biggest night of migration. We just often don't estimate the maximum value of how many birds are actually flying, and it's really hard to do. Effectively, these models are trying to predict every season the rarest of events that are occurring. And when I mean rare, it's that big pulses of migration happen on so few nights, right? If we are looking at migration for 120 nights, the vast majority of it happens on such few nights, 10 nights, and we're always trying to predict those rare things. And so we often under predict it. It's not to say that we missed predicting the big night of migration, we just didn't get the number exactly right. I missed a lot in my explanations there. Let me see if I can catch back up.
There is a question. from
It's great to see.
Joan Weaver about uh, lighting procedures for a dairy farm. I can probably address that in our little post presentation presentation. And same with the part about city or state government.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to address it, but I don't want to steal your thunder, Kelsey, there, so
No,
I'll
go for it
punt
if
on
you've
that
got
one.
ideas too.
Yeah, so some of the lighting stuff is tricky, right? That, people have lights and, they might need to work and get something done, in the wee hours. So there are certainly tensions there. Some of the things that we recommend, there's like a few axes that we can focus on light pollution. Directing light to where it's needed is, one of the big components, right? Lights that just shine up into the atmosphere are, it's really just a waste of the energy and the light that we're producing. And so if it can be shielded, that's great. If it can be dimmed, that's better. Um, and then if the lights can be changed in terms of color, this can be a little bit more expensive as well. But the warmer the color light, the better it is for not attracting things. And so what I mean by that is oranger to red colored lights um, affect most flying things less than like your really white to blue colored lights. And so there's sort of a few dimensions that we can provide recommendations on. Whether the farmers are going to change that, that's a challenging discussion. And so that might be a quick chat. Sometimes folks just don't know. Sometimes there's interventions that happen at sort of city municipal levels. And so that's potentially pressure comes in from that way. And so I think there's a few conversations that can happen to try to do that. Again, I'm not saying it's easy though. From a birder's perspective, the predictions don't tell you. Yeah, Bob raises a point. I agree with you, Bob. These are one of the things that, in a like a sarcastic way, I often say we don't predict where the birds land, we predict where they're flying. And the exciting part for bird watchers is to go figure out where they settled into the landscape. And so that's a hard problem though, right? We really do wish we could predict that better. It's just that birds make selections that are sometimes tricky to disentangle, right? And so there's certainly habitat predictors there that, the forested area is better. But our models don't really discern whether the birds are leaving or coming. And so that part is a little bit of a mystery and sort of the frontiers of what we hope to learn going forward. Um, Kelsey, where am I at with time and questions? I don't want to overstep here.
So it's 7:55. There is a question from Angela that says, I'm wondering if the dark areas in northern Wisconsin and the UP are dark because birds have already left. And that's probably something that you can answer better than me.
Oh, in terms of like dark in terms of on the maps, I'm guessing, in terms of intensity.
Yes, that would be my
Yeah,
guess.
yeah. That could be some of it. Yeah, certainly. We're gonna get waves and waves of birds coming, and so tonight, might not look like a great night for different parts of Wisconsin. It's usually driven by the weather phenomena that are coming through, and so my guess, maybe some of the birds have cleared out, but probably the dominant thing that's happening is that the winds are just not conducive to head south right now, and so the birds are probably going to bottle up in the northern part of Wisconsin for, a few days potentially as the conditions, manifest. And then eventually it's almost like a floodgate, right? The conditions change, the atmosphere gets better, and then you get another wave of birds. And so don't think that, because you don't see the birds tomorrow that, all is lost for fall migration. There's another 2 months and there'll be wave after wave of big migration coming, right? And so, probably every week from here till the end of October, we'll get sprinklings of big waves of awesome birds coming through our Midwest region.
Okay, there's two more questions that I think you can answer, and then the other ones are probably I'll cover. But just general, what is the greatest danger for birds migrating at night?
Yeah, great question. Greatest dangers for birds migrating at night. There's sort of a number of them. The dangers at night, I would say, are there's some form of collision. And so collisions are occurring day or night. Collisions might be with communication towers. Those collisions are often, at least with communication towers, sort of driven by a light pollution effect that birds get attracted to the lights on a tower. Usually not a red flashing light, but it's usually a constant glowing white light. They get attracted, they collide. Um, Lights play a big part of collisions with windows as well. And so I think those are the big hazards in terms of direct mortality during a night's worth of migration. But in many ways, once the birds get up into the atmosphere, there's not a lot of threats to them, right? That they've cleared most aerial obstacles. It's usually these transition points of them going up or coming down into the terrestrial landscape. And so the lights on the terrestrial landscape pulling them into a suboptimal area, maybe ultimately leading to collisions with windows. And so those are some of the threats that we think a lot about. Do airplanes get tangled with migrating birds at night? Yeah, to some extent. Airplanes can be certainly a risk at night. It's a lot of songbirds. Big aircraft probably don't face much from, there's certainly sometimes damage. But like a small songbird can probably easily pass through a jet engine at this point and not really have much damage. And then just most jet engine airplanes are flying, uh, many times higher than most migratory birds. Most migratory birds are sitting below 1,000 meters. I'm not sure what that equates to in feet, 3,000 feet or so. Most jet engine planes that you fly commercially are sitting at like 20 to 30,000 feet above the ground. And so they usually clear most of where the birds are.
Okay, there's one last question here, and then we will move on. But there's a question, have you found that you need to account for exceptional circumstances like tomorrow's lunar eclipse, or do they generally not have a big enough impact to worry about?
That's a fun question to think about. Um, it's not that we don't want to think about it. We probably don't have the capacity to integrate it into our models fast enough, admittedly. And so some of those things are really like, from a historical standpoint, quite rare in our data. And so we just don't have enough examples of what happens. But there's lots of great studies on, what eclipses do to birds in general. And so in some of these eclipses, you get really odd behaviors of, if you get an eclipse during the day and it gets dark, some birds think that it's time to start migrating and they launch up into the atmosphere for a very brief amount of time. Sometimes birds start singing like it's a dusk or dawn chorus. And folks have studied that. And so it's not to say that we're not interested in it. It's just that they're rare relative to the big patterns that we're looking at. But that's a really fun thing to think about.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I think that answers everybody's questions. And yeah, Lisa has put in the chat that we have some window treatment solutions on the SOS Save Our Songbirds website. So definitely recommend checking those out. Um, there's been a lot of questions about what can we do now that we know about all these, um, migrating birds and how we're predicting them. So what can we do? So I have a short presentation just with some solutions for everyone. So let me get my screen shared for you. Where's that button? Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that. But yeah, so now we have heard the science. behind the migration forecasts. So I'm going to share some ways that we can help as individuals. So just to remind everyone, my name is Kelsey Bell. I am the Strategy and Outreach Specialist for Lights Out Wisconsin. And if you're not familiar with Lights Out Wisconsin, that's unsurprising because we're fairly new. We are a coalition of Wisconsin-based organizations, conservation groups, and dark sky organizations that are working together to reduce the impacts of light pollution on birds and other wildlife, people, and the night sky. We formed in the fall of 2025, so we're fairly fresh, but we have a very large group of collaborators, all with a different vested interest towards the same goal. So we have organizations involved that are interested in bird conservation. We have energy saving organizations, invertebrate conservation organizations, dark sky preservation orgs, a large variety of interests, all with the same goal of reducing light pollution in Wisconsin, which can help birds, and that's why we're all here. So, goals of Lights Out Wisconsin are to educate about the impacts of light pollution on wildlife, people, and the night sky, and to share practical ways that we can, sorry, practical ways to use outdoor lighting to reduce the impacts of light, artificial light at night, as well as build a statewide culture of outdoor lighting that reduces those impacts of light pollution long term and hopefully permanently. So, I want to give a background on what light pollution is because it's a bit of a new concept, and a lot of people probably aren't thinking about it as broadly as it is. So, many people, when they think of light pollution, they think of areas of really bright lights in large cities. So you can see in this photo, this is Madison across the lake at night, and you can see it's giving off a lot of light pollution. And although that is part of it, that's not the whole story. So light pollution is actually a growing environmental concern that impacts whole ecosystems from plants to wildlife and people. For reference, 80% of people in North America can no longer see the Milky Way from their own homes, and 99% of Americans are impacted by light pollution in some way. So, the formal definition of light pollution is excessive or inappropriate artificial light in the outdoors at night, which basically means outdoor light that is being used where and when it isn't needed. Um, and I just want to share the types so that you have an idea and aren't thinking as narrow when you're thinking about solutions. So there's four types of light pollution. We have sky glow. That's the what people typically think of. That's that glowing dome you see above cities. There is light trespass. This is light that is in a place where it shouldn't be. Think of your neighbor who might have a light on their shed or garage that shines into your living room or maybe your bedroom. And it is the number one complaint in neighborhoods. And then our third light pollution is glare. So this is excessive brightness that not only is visually uncomfortable because it hurts your eyes, but it also creates or reduces contrast, making it harder for you to see. And then there's what we call clutter, which is crowded clusters of bright light that can cause distractions and reduce safety. So things like flashing billboards. And I put this diagram here because it's a good representation of what we would consider useful light versus light pollution. So anywhere in this area at the bottom, if you follow the cursor, is the area that is meant to be lit. And this we would consider useful light. It's either for visibility or safety. But then you have light that extends down to this gentleman's eyes or into this house. It's also extending up into the sky, and all of this extra light is what we would consider light pollution. So why does light pollution matter? Obviously, it impacts our ability to see the stars and the night sky, but it's there's a lot more to it beyond just preserving the night sky, birds being one of the things. But when you think about it, life on Earth adapted to centuries of predictable day and night cycles. So when we use excessive artificial night light at night, it disrupts those biological functions. So many things are impacted. Wildlife is a big one. We talked about birds with Kyle. We mentioned that when birds migrate at night and when there is excessive light pollution, they get drawn into that light and they often get disoriented and their chances of colliding with windows is much higher, and windows are the number two threat to birds worldwide. We lose 1 billion birds per year just in the US to windows. Um, Insects are also affected. So those swirling balls of insects you see it around lights, they're there because they're confused. This exhausts them. It also makes them more prone to predation, and it impacts their ability to pollinate at normal levels. And then bats and other nocturnal animals rely on dark skies to forage. They rely on it to reproduce. So all of these are impacted, as well as people don't think about it, but plants. Um, trees that are near streetlights have been shown to hold their leaves longer rather than prepping for winter. And then flowers will bloom early because of artificial light because it tricks them into thinking that daylight is longer. So we have lots of impacts to all sorts of creatures and ecosystem services. Another impact is to people. So there's health impacts that people experience. That's everything from affecting our sleep, our hormones, and there's a new study this year that came out that has shows that light pollution impacts allergy season. So areas with higher light pollution tend to have 40 to 50 day longer allergy season than rural areas. And that is all linked to increased light because you've got longer pollen or longer blooming times for plants. There's the cost of light pollution. It's estimated that 35% of light is wasted. So Kyle mentioned shielding your light and focusing your light. The 35% is light that has not been pointed in a proper direction or shielded. And this actually has been valued to be $3 to $4.5 billion per year wasted in the US just due to overlighting. And I'm just going to talk briefly about safety. Light does impact our safety. Brighter doesn't always mean safer. So it might give the perception of safer. However, we talked about glare being um, a type of light pollution. And what glare does is in overlit areas, it actually creates blind spots. So this is a really popular photo that floats around describing glare, but in this top photo, there is actually a man standing in the same spot. You just can't see it because there's a blind spot created from the glare. So um, there's with new technologies, there's things to consider when it comes to safety and overlighting areas. The good news is we do have practical and affordable solutions to combat light pollution. So I'm going to share some simple things that you can do to help birds and also reduce light pollution at the same time. And the first one I want to call out is signing up for lights out alerts. So Kyle did mention these that birdcast.org sends out lights out alerts in the top 10% of migration nights, and these 8 to 10 nights per season account for a combined 50% of all traffic that is coming through. So these are really good to sign up for so that you know they sent one out today. So we know that today we want to turn the lights out because it's a critical night for migrating birds, and turning out lights is a really easy way to help them. I would also recommend signing up for the Lights Out Wisconsin alerts. We do not send them out with every birdcast alert, but we do send out practical tips on how to make changes, and we give a warning on when the peak migration is about to start, and we might give a reminder. But we also send out alerts across the season. So fireflies is um, another species or organism that is heavily impacted by light pollution. Their blinking lights get lost in the light pollution and then they can't communicate, which is how they reproduce. So it's one of the reasons we have less fireflies around. So signing up for alerts, we send them out year round for different events. Okay, number two thing that you can do, and Kyle did mention this, but swapping your bulbs to a warmer colored bulb. This is something that's pretty easy to do, and the warmer colored bulbs are becoming more readily available every day. And this can significantly reduce light pollution and sky glow. So color temperature is measured in kelvins, and Kelvin tells us how warm or cool a light appears. It is not the temperature like of touch to the bulb. It's not how much heat the bulb puts out. It's how it visually looks, either warm or cool. So a lower Kelvin value is going to produce a warmer amber colored light that is less disruptive to wildlife and people compared to a cooler blue rich light. 2700 Kelvin or lower is what you want to aim for. And this is just a comparison of what that looks like. It does not affect the brightness, only the appearance of the color. And then this is a really cool example of it's a local example. So in Ontario, Wisconsin, the Kickapoo Valley Dark Sky Initiative changed the light bulbs of the village hall and the fire station. And you can see that the before, these were 5,000 Kelvin lights, and you can see that all of this light is being wasted into the sky. There's lots of glare. When they switch to 1800, it doesn't impact your visibility at all, but it's not shining into the sky. So things like that are really easy, and this was a 90% reduction in sky glow. And then the kind of more obvious thing to do is probably just to turn out the lights. In other words, we just want you to use less light. And there's different ways to use less lights. This is a graphic from Dark Sky International that just illustrates the impact of different light levels from bright with high glare to off and, the good, better, best kind of options. But I wanted to throw up some of these examples just to get people to think about other things other than just your porch lights and your street lights, things that we can have an impact on. So yard lights look really nice and we like to sit out and enjoy them, but it might be worth putting them on maybe a timer or considering if they're really useful all the time. Turning them off when you're not using them is very helpful. Things like a light that shines, like this one down here, that shines up into a tree probably isn't very useful. Not only is it shining light into the open sky, but it's also shining it on a tree where a bat or a bird might roost. So looking at things like this too, like maybe putting a cap over that light could still help give it the function you want while not contributing to the light pollution. So you want to ask yourself if the lights are useful, are they targeted, are they low level, only using the minimum brightness required, controlled, and then are they warm colored? And these are what we call the 5 principles for better nighttime lighting. And we can throw a link in the chat for more details on that. So the basics of it for turning out your lights or using less light is turn off the light. If you can't turn off the light, consider shielding the light and ensuring that your light is only facing downward and not shining up into the sky. Putting your lights on timers so that they're only on during the periods you actually need them. And one thing that a lot of people don't consider is closing your blinds. Light spill from inside your house can impact light pollution and increase the sky glow. So closing curtains can be another really important solution. And then I have one bonus action to do, and that's to share. So share the information you learn, share it with your network, your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, talk to local leaders. We have resources on the Lights Out Wisconsin website on different ordinances that are being passed in different communities across Wisconsin and the US. because people are starting to listen to this and they're starting to make changes and try to reduce light pollution. And I just want to say one final takeaway on this part before I wrap things up. But um, the idea is that to preserve the natural night, protect birds, other wildlife, their ecosystems, and people, we just need to use smarter, more intentional lighting choices. Notice that we haven't said we need to turn out all the lights everywhere. We just need to be more intentional about what we're lighting. So I'm going to throw this up here. I can throw all the links in the chat for some of these resources, but if you are looking for the forecast and alerts, um, Birdcast and Aero Ecolab are the go-tos for that. And then if you're looking for lighting solutions, Dark Sky Wisconsin and Kickapoo Valley Dark Sky Initiative are going to have a lot of information for you. And then the Lights Out Wisconsin website tried to combine all of those a little bit, and we summarize some of the information and link out to a lot of these organizations that we partner with. So feel free to screenshot this. I can go back to it as well, and we'll share the chat or share the um, links in the chat. And the last thing I want to do is remind everyone that there's a lights out alert tonight. So please share this, turn out your lights, close your blinds. It's the very first peak migration night of the year, and we want to get as many people aware of it as possible. We will share, there's a link to a Facebook. We've been sharing it on social media, so we'll put the links to those. And if you want to share it in your community groups or on your Facebook page, that really helps spread the word to let everyone else know. And with that, that concludes. If anyone has any questions for me, or if you still have burning questions for Kyle, we can do that too. I just have to see if I can get to the chat now. Oh, Lisa's been on the, okay, there's questions in the chat. Okay, so first question is how the lights impact birds. Okay, so I mentioned this briefly. So I don't know if this was before or after I mentioned it, but what happens is when birds are migrating, the bright lights draw them into the cities and they get disoriented and they often, uh, they get kind of lost and confused. They get really exhausted and they end up colliding with windows. So that is kind of the biggest impact to light pollution for birds and why we want to turn the lights out while they're moving. Um, Lisa's got all of my links in there. Good. Okay, someone asked, does it reduce energy costs? Yes. So I'm going to go back to the Ontario. I think my screen's still sharing. Yeah. So back to this Ontario, Wisconsin. They actually reported a 75% reduction in energy use once they switched from this 5,000 Kelvin to 1,800 Kelvin. Um, that is going to be an extreme level because some of these lights were old sodium, what's the word? They were old, kind of outdated lights, and they switched to LED. But typically, dropping from like a 5,000 LED to a 2,200 LED still reduces your energy costs. Okay, that's the same question. Okay, so someone's asking if we can send out a document with the links. We can. There's going to be one that comes out. We'll send a follow-up email to everybody afterwards with some informational links from the presenters. Okay, someone's asking if there's a handout so we can put it in mailboxes. Yes, there's several organizations that have stuff like this available. So Dark Sky Wisconsin has information on how to write a letter to your neighbor in a polite, conversational way. The Lights Out Wisconsin website has links to printouts that you can print either at home or if you're part of an organization and you want to print them more broadly. We have door hangers, we have half-page info sheets, and we have bookmarks, and those are all free and available to print out online at the Lights Out Wisconsin website. And Lisa. All right, I think that is everybody's questions. So I'm just going to go back to one of these pages here. And so that everyone has the information if you want for tomorrow's webinar again. If you like coffee like me, I'd highly recommend going. I will be there in the audience because I like coffee. Um, but thank you. Okay, so yeah, I think we're ready to wrap up. So I just want to thank everyone for coming and thank you, Kyle, for taking the time to be here with us tonight. Um, I know I learned a lot, so I hope everyone else did. You will receive a follow-up email with links to resources that we mentioned. And then we encourage you, like I said, please share this with family and friends. The more people that are aware about it, the better. And yeah, thanks for joining us and happy migration. I hope you see something cool.